The girl who spoke the unspeakable. The city was restless that night, the kind of restless where streetlights flickered in the fog and people hurried home without looking at each other. Somewhere near the edge of the market district, where the stalls were closing and the smell of roasted corn hung in the air, a little girl wandered barefoot along the cracked pavement. Her name was Amara, though no one there knew it yet. Her blue jacket, 2 sizes too big, flapped against her thin frame as the wind pressed through the alleyways. Her braids had loosened, strands of hair brushing against her cheeks as she walked, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring not at what was in front of her but at something far beyond. People noticed her, of course. You could not help but notice, a child walking alone with such strange calm, as if the noise of the city did not exist. One shopkeeper leaned on his counter and frowned. "Where's your mother, little one?" he asked. Amara stopped, tilted her head, and looked at him in a way that made his stomach twist. "You took $20 from your friend's wallet last week," she whispered. His mouth dropped open. "What did you just say?" Amara blinked. "You told yourself it was nothing, but now you feel guilty every time you see him." The man's face drained of color. He shoved his apron aside and stormed back into his shop, muttering curses under his breath, but he did not come out again. Others soon had similar encounters. A man in a neat suit tried to help her, asking kindly, "Where are you going, sweetheart?" But she only replied, "Your wife knows what you did last summer. She cries when you leave." The man staggered backward, shaking his head violently, as if to push her words away. "Liar," he hissed, though the sweat on his forehead betrayed him. He disappeared into the crowd, walking faster than before, leaving Amara alone again under the dim street lamp glow. By the time the police found her, called in by frightened whispers of, "That strange little girl," she was sitting on the steps of a bakery, her bare feet tucked under her, her eyes still distant. An officer crouched in front of her and asked, "What's your name? Where's your family?" Amara's lips moved slowly. "They're gone," she said. "But I can see the things people hide." The officer gave a nervous chuckle and exchanged a look with his partner. "Delusional," one of them muttered, until Amara turned to him with quiet certainty. "You're still wearing her perfume," she said softly. "The woman you see every Thursday." The officer froze, his mouth half open. The bakery owner, watching from the doorway, gasped and stepped back. The next day, newspapers began to murmur about the barefoot girl. Not her name, no one had asked for it yet, but her strange ability. "Child claims to read minds," one headline wrote. "A hoax or a haunting?" another questioned. Still, most people brushed it off as nonsense, a child making guesses, tricks of chance and fear. But the police were not laughing. She had asked for only one person, repeating the request over and over in her small, steady voice. "I want to see Judge Randall." When she was brought to the courthouse, the building itself seemed to lean forward with curiosity. Reporters crowded outside, their cameras clicking as the little girl walked past with her jacket sleeves dragging and her feet silent against the marble steps. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Lawyers, clerks, and citizens sat pressed together on the benches, some eager for a spectacle, others uneasy. Judge Randall himself sat at the center of it all, his black robes crisp, his silver hair gleaming beneath the overhead lights. He was a man who had built his life on authority, his gavel striking fear into criminals and his voice commanding respect in every corner of the city. When he saw the girl led to the front by the bailiff, his lips curved in a thin, amused smile. "Who brought this child here?" he asked, his tone both annoyed and curious. "She asked for you, sir," the bailiff said nervously. "She wouldn't speak to anyone else." Randall leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses. "And why is that?" Amara lifted her chin, her brown eyes locking onto his with a steadiness that made some in the room shiver. "Because I can read your mind," she said softly. The room fell silent. A wave of laughter soon followed, rolling through the spectators like nervous thunder. Even Randall let out a sharp chuckle, shaking his head. "You can read my mind?" That's cute, little one. But this isn't a stage for childish games. Amara did not flinch. She stood with her small hands at her sides, her eyes never leaving his face. You don't believe me, she whispered. Just like the others, until I tell you what you've been hiding all these years. The laughter died abruptly. People exchanged startled looks. Randall's smirk faltered for just a second before he straightened in his chair. Nonsense, he said firmly. Take her away. But Amara took one slow step closer. Her voice was calm, but each word seemed to sink into the marble floor. You wake up at night and sweat. You see her in your dreams. You pushed her. You didn't mean for her to die. But she did. Gasps filled the courtroom. Lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Reporters' pens scratched furiously against paper. Judge Randall gripped his gavel tighter, his knuckles turning white. Enough, he barked. This is slander. This is madness. Yet Amara raised her hand, so small and fragile, and placed it gently on the crown of his head. The bailiff flinched, the audience leaned forward, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Amara's eyes fluttered shut, her braids brushing against her shoulders as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. Her lips parted, and she whispered the words that would shatter the judge's carefully built world. You buried her near the river. The crowd begins to doubt the moment those words left Amara's lips. You buried her near the river. The air in the courtroom seemed to thicken, as if the walls themselves had absorbed her whisper and refused to let it fade. A wave of silence pressed over the people present, broken only by the frantic scratching of reporters' pens and the faint hum of the overhead lights. Judge Randall's face, usually composed in the confidence of law, drained of color for the briefest instant before he slammed his gavel down with a force that cracked the wood. Order! Order in this court, his voice thundered, though a slight tremor betrayed him. But the silence did not obey him. It belonged to the girl now. Every eye fixed on her small figure, her thin hand still resting lightly against the judge's head. She slowly opened her eyes, her gaze steady, almost sorrowful. She trusted you, Amara murmured. She thought you would protect her that night. But when she said no, you lost control. Her words were not shouted, yet they carried into every corner of the room, threading themselves into the ears of the crowd like unavoidable truth. A woman in the back row gasped, covering her mouth. Lawyers shifted in their seats, some whispering hurriedly to one another, others staring at the judge with suspicion they had never dared to feel before. One attorney, bold enough to speak, stood and shouted, "What is this circus? She's a child. She can't know such things." But his voice trembled, his protest more a plea to restore sanity than a statement of confidence. Randall seized the chance, slamming his gavel again. Exactly. This is a farce. Lies and theatrics meant to discredit me. He pointed at the bailiff. Remove her at once before this nonsense grows further. The bailiff hesitated. His hand hovered, unsure whether to obey. Amara turned her head toward him, her eyes dark and piercing. Your daughter cries herself to sleep, she whispered softly, so softly only those near the front could hear. She thinks you don't notice when she hides under the blanket. But you do, don't you? And you don't know how to tell her you're sorry. The bailiff froze. His throat bobbed. He stepped back slowly, shaking his head, unable to carry out the command. Murmurs exploded across the benches as the crowd realized this was no trick rehearsed for the judge alone. She saw into others too. Detective Harris, who had entered quietly at the back to observe after hearing of the strange child, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. He had dealt with liars, manipulators, and so-called psychics in his time. But this girl was different. Her words carried an unbearable weight because they struck at wounds no one else could possibly know. He studied the judge, whose usually proud shoulders had slumped ever so slightly, sweat glistening at his temples despite the chill of the courthouse. Randall cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. She is making wild guesses, he barked, though his voice no longer carried the authority it once did. Anyone could invent a story of rivers and shadows. Amara stepped closer, her bare feet soundless on the polished wood. Her gaze never wavered from his, and though her voice remained soft, it sliced through the courtroom's tension like a blade. "You see her in your dreams every night," she whispered. "She calls your name and you wake up choking on fear. You've lived your life hiding from her voice, but you cannot escape her." A reporter dropped his pen, the clatter echoing sharply in the stillness. The young man seated in the third row clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "Who is she talking about?" he muttered, his voice breaking. His eyes flickered with grief, as though the name the girl had yet to speak already hovered on his lips. Someone else, a woman in a gray coat, hissed under her breath, "What if it's true?" The judge pounded his gavel again, the crack echoing like a gunshot. "Enough of this." His voice rose to a near shout, desperation sharpening its edges. "This court will not tolerate baseless accusations, especially from a child." Yet his words, meant to steady the room, had the opposite effect. The crowd began to murmur louder, doubt spreading like fire through dry grass. Each person remembered her earlier whispers to the bailiff, to the officer the night before, to strangers on the street. Coincidence could not explain them all. And now, here in the heart of law, she had dared to speak to the most powerful man in the room without fear. Detective Harris stepped forward then, his voice calm but firm. "With respect, Judge Randall, maybe we should hear the child out. If she is lying, the truth will reveal itself. If not—" He paused, his eyes narrowing as they flicked between the trembling judge and the girl's unwavering calm. "Then perhaps the truth has been waiting for too long." Randall glared at him, fury and panic tangled in his expression. "Detective, you are out of line." Amara lowered her hand from the judge's head at last. She folded her small arms across her chest, her voice steady as stone. "You can shout all you want," she said, "but shouting doesn't stop the truth." And with those words, the courtroom no longer belonged to Judge Randall. It belonged to the barefoot girl who could hear the unspeakable. The bracelet and the river. The murmur of voices in the courtroom grew into a storm, the kind of storm that rattles windows and makes every whisper sound like thunder. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras flashing in bursts that lit up the tense faces of lawyers, citizens, and clerks. The air smelled faintly of dust and sweat, heavy with the weight of something no one could name but everyone could feel. At the center of it all stood Amara, small and barefoot, her oversized jacket slipping from one shoulder. Her eyes, too old for her years, never left Judge Randall, who gripped his bench like a sailor clinging to a mast in a rising sea. Randall tried to speak, to bark orders that would reassert his power, but the words caught in his throat. Every attempt at authority was swallowed by the murmurs of doubt around him, by the memory of the child's whisper. "You buried her near the river." He wiped his forehead, though the room was cool, and when his eyes darted across the crowd, he found no sympathy, no faith, only suspicion. Amara took a step closer, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. The bailiff made no move to stop her. Neither did Detective Harris, who stood now with arms crossed, his sharp gaze trained on the judge's trembling hands. "You kept something," Amara said softly, her voice clear despite the noise. "Something small because you couldn't let go. You told yourself it was a memory, but it's proof. It's still hidden even now." A lawyer scoffed, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "What nonsense is this? A child spinning riddles." He tried to wave the reporters back, but no one moved. The girl's words had carved through the room like a chisel into stone, leaving cracks no laughter could mend. Randall's lips parted, his breath shallow. "Stop this," he hissed, but his voice had lost its thunder. Amara tilted her head, her braids falling against her cheeks. Her eyes fluttered shut for a moment as though she were listening to a voice that only she could hear. When they opened again, they seemed to burn with quiet fire. "A bracelet," she whispered. "Silver, with a little charm, shaped like a heart. You tore it from her wrist when she scratched your face that night." The courtroom froze. The young man in the third row, who had sat with clenched fists since the girl first spoke, shot up to his feet. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Claire!" His eyes filled with tears. "She had a bracelet like that. You said she ran away, but she never would have left without it." Chaos erupted. People gasped, others shouted, Reporters leaned forward, cameras flashing wildly. The young man's grief poured into the room like a flood, shaking even those who had come only to observe. "Claire was my sister," he cried, pointing a trembling finger at the judge. "You knew something, you always knew." Randall's face drained of color, his hands shaking so violently that the gavel slipped from his grasp and clattered against the bench. The sound rang through the courtroom like a death knell. Amara raised her hand again, her small palm hovering in the air before gently resting against the judge's head once more. "You thought no one would ever know," she said softly, almost kindly, as though speaking to a frightened child instead of a man who held power over hundreds of lives. "You buried her near the riverbank. You covered her with rocks thinking the current would take her, but the soil held her. She is still there. And the bracelet—" She paused, her eyes piercing him like blades. "You kept it. It's under the floorboards in your study, in the box you never open but cannot throw away." Gasps rippled through the room. Even the most skeptical faces turned pale. Every detail was too sharp, too precise, to be dismissed as chance. The reporters shouted over one another now, their voices blending into a chaotic chorus. "What? Bracelet? What box? Is this true, Judge?" Randall lurched to his feet, his chair toppling backward with a crash. His voice broke as he roared, "Enough! This child is lying. None of this is true." His fists slammed the bench, but instead of restoring order, his rage only fueled the storm. The crowd no longer saw a dignified judge. They saw a man unraveling, sweating, shaking, denying too loudly. Detective Harris stepped forward, his voice carrying authority now where Randall's had failed. "Sir," he said evenly, his eyes never leaving the judge, "we will need to search your home." The judge spun toward him, his eyes wide with fury and panic. You dare hide from the truth," Amara interrupted, her voice calm, steady, unshaken by the chaos around her. Her small hand lowered from his head, and she looked at him not with hatred, but with a kind of sorrow that cut deeper than any accusation. "She trusted you," she whispered again. "And when she fell, you told yourself it was an accident. But you buried her. You buried her, and you thought the earth would keep your secret." The room erupted again, shouts of outrage and disbelief mingling with cries of grief. The young man who claimed Claire as his sister collapsed onto the bench, sobbing into his hands. Reporters pushed against the rails, their cameras flashing, their voices demanding answers. And there stood Amara, barefoot, her thin frame steady against the tide of noise. She looked not at the crowd, nor the reporters, nor the lawyers who whispered frantically, but only at the man before her, the man who had built his life on judgment and law, who now stood trembling like a child caught in the light of truth. For the first time, Judge Randall could not meet another's gaze. The breaking point, the courtroom no longer felt like a place of law. It had become a theater of chaos, every whisper sharper than a verdict, every gasp louder than a sentence. The young man who had cried out Claire's name sat trembling in his seat, his shoulders shaking as he tried to process what the barefoot child had revealed. Reporters pressed forward against the wooden rails, their cameras snapping like gunfire, their voices overlapping in a frenzy of questions that no one could answer. The lawyers looked helpless, torn between their duty to the court and their own gnawing fear that the ground beneath their careers had just cracked wide open. And at the center of it all, Judge Randall stood exposed. The black robe that once made him untouchable now looked heavy on his shoulders, as if it were dragging him down into the truth he had spent decades burying. His hands shook as he slammed his gavel against the bench again and again, each strike weaker than the last, the wood splintering under the strain. "Order! I demand order!" he bellowed, but his voice no longer commanded respect. It cracked like old glass, thin and brittle. Amara, standing just a few steps from him, swayed on her feet. Her small hands twitched at her sides, her face pale, her breaths shallow. Her eyes fluttered closed, and for a moment, it seemed as though she was listening again, not to the living, not to the noise in the courtroom, but to something deeper, something only she could hear. When she opened her eyes, there was a distant glaze in them, as if she were caught between two worlds. "She's still screaming," Amara whispered. Her voice, though soft, carried clearly across the courtroom, silencing even the most frantic reporters. She doesn't stop. Every night she screams your name, she begs you to tell the truth. Randall staggered backward, his chair scraping against the bench. His chest rose and fell rapidly, sweat streaming down his temples. "Lies!" he shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. "This child is possessed. She's been coached. This is an attack on the integrity of the court itself." But even as he shouted, his eyes darted wildly, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Detective Harris stepped closer to the bench, his voice firm but calm, the steady tone of a man who had seen many suspects unravel. "Judge Randall, you need to sit down," he said evenly. "This has gone far enough. If there is evidence in your home, we will find it. The more you deny, the worse this will be." The judge's face twisted with fury, his lips curling back as if he might lash out. "You dare lecture me?" he roared. "I built this courtroom. I am the law here." His voice rose hoarse and ragged, his gavel pounding again. "I will not be destroyed by a child's lies." But Amara did not flinch. Her small frame swayed as though she were barely holding herself upright, her breaths coming faster, but her eyes locked onto his with unwavering clarity. "You destroyed yourself," she whispered, her voice trembling not from fear but from the burden of carrying what she had seen. "The night you chose silence, you dug your own grave. The earth remembers, the river remembers, and she remembers." Suddenly, Amara's knees buckled. The crowd gasped as she collapsed forward, clutching her head with both hands. Her cry was not loud, but it pierced through every heart in the room. "Make it stop. She won't stop screaming." Her small body trembled violently on the floor as though the voices she carried had grown too heavy to bear. Detective Harris rushed forward, pushing aside the stunned bailiff, and crouched beside her. He lifted the child gently into his arms, his jaw tight with concern. "Easy now. I've got you," he murmured, though his voice shook with unease. He could feel the tremors racing through her thin frame, the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Her eyes rolled back for a moment, then opened again, wide and glassy, staring past him into a space he could not see. "She's louder now," Amara gasped, her tiny hands clutching at his collar. "She says he cannot hide anymore. She says, the box under the floor is waiting. She says she won't be silent until justice comes." The courtroom erupted again, reporters shouting, citizens crying out, the young man screaming for the truth. Randall clutched the bench for support, his face ashen, his lips moving in silent prayers that found no answer. His power, once absolute, was dissolving under the weight of a little girl's whispers. For the first time in his long career, Judge Randall was not the one holding the gavel. Truth itself was pounding against him, and he had no defense. And as Detective Harris carried Amara out of the chaos, the last words she spoke before losing consciousness sent a shiver through every soul in that room. She says she won't rest until he falls. The confession, the courthouse never truly quieted after Amara was carried out. Even as Detective Harris guided her limp body into a waiting chair in the corridor, reporters pressed their faces against the glass doors, shouting questions that no one dared to answer. Inside, the courtroom seethed with unrest, voices rising and falling like waves in a storm. The young man who had cried out for his sister sat hunched forward, his face buried in his hands, whispering her name again and again, as if by speaking it, he could anchor her spirit back into the world. Lawyers tried to bring order, but order no longer belonged to them. The trial had shifted into something rawer, more primal. It was not law being tested now, but truth itself. Detective Harris returned to the center of the room, his presence carrying more weight than the trembling judge on the bench. His calm, measured voice cut through the chaos. "We will open an investigation immediately. If the child is right, then evidence exists. And if evidence exists, it will be found." The crowd hushed, all eyes swiveling toward Judge Randall, who sat slumped against his seat as though the very wood beneath him might swallow him whole. His once commanding frame was now hunched, his face slick with sweat, his lips trembling. Randall tried to recover his dignity, but every word sounded hollow. This is madness," he stammered. You cannot launch an investigation on the words of a child. She's delirious. She's been manipulated. His hand shook as he gestured vaguely toward the reporters, toward Harris, toward the young man sobbing in the third row. This is a plot to destroy me. Do you not see? This is political. This is, but his words drowned in the rising murmur of the crowd, a murmur that carried the unmistakable sound of disbelief. The people no longer looked at him as a figure of justice. They looked at him as a man cornered by truth. Hours later, after the courtroom had been cleared, Detective Harris led a small team to Randall's home. The grand house stood on a quiet street, its tall windows glowing faintly against the night sky. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old wood and polished leather. Shelves lined with legal volumes loomed over the study, but it was the floor that caught Harris's attention. He knelt, running his fingers across the polished boards, listening to the echo beneath. Here, he said quietly. The team pried, the boards loose. Beneath them lay a small wooden box, dusty and worn, its lock rusted but fragile. When it was pulled free and opened, silence fell upon the room. Nestled inside, tarnished with age but unmistakable, was a silver bracelet with a charm shaped like a heart. A faint scratch across the charm caught the light, a wound on the metal that seemed to mirror the wound it had left in so many lives. The room was still for a long moment. Then the young man, Claire's brother, who had followed with trembling, hands clenched in fists, let out a broken cry. He staggered forward, his knees buckling as he collapsed before the box. That's hers, he whispered hoarsely, his tears falling onto the wood. That's Claire's. She never took it off. Never. Detective Harris closed his eyes briefly, his jaw tightening. The evidence was no longer whispers. It was cold, solid, undeniable. Back in the courtroom the next morning, the bracelet sat on the judge's bench like a silent accuser. Amara, pale but awake, was brought in by Harris, her thin frame leaning against him for support. The crowd filled every seat, their faces tense with anticipation. Randall sat hunched forward, his eyes fixed on the bracelet as if it were a snake poised to strike. When the proceedings began, Harris laid out the discovery. The box, the bracelet, the location, exactly as the child had described. Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens tearing at paper. Randall's hands trembled visibly now, his mask of control shredded beyond repair. Amara stood again at the center of the room. She no longer looked like a child lost. She looked like a messenger, weary but resolute. Her voice was soft, but it carried into every ear, demanding attention. She says thank you, she whispered, her eyes locked on the bracelet. Because now no one can deny her anymore. Randall let out a strangled sound, somewhere between a sob and a growl. His hands clawed at his robe as though he might tear himself free from the moment, from the truth pressing in on him from all sides. Stop it, he begged, his voice cracking. Stop this madness. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean... The words tumbled out of him unbidden, a confession too long buried, rising like floodwater through cracks in a dam. His face crumpled as he collapsed forward, his body shaking with sobs. I didn't mean to kill her, he cried, his voice echoing through the stunned silence. It was an accident. She wouldn't listen. She scratched me and I lost control. I thought if I buried her, if I hid the bracelet, no one would ever know. His words broke, off in a wail that silenced even the reporters. The mighty judge who had once decided the fate of others now lay broken, his fate sealed by his own lips. Amara's eyes softened as she whispered again, more to the unseen than to the living. She says she can rest now, because you spoke the truth. And in that moment, the courtroom understood that justice had come not from the gavel, but from the voice of a little girl who carried the weight of the silenced. The trial of truth. The courthouse had never felt so heavy with silence. For years, it had been a place where verdicts were spoken and lives changed in the strike of a gavel. But now it was something else entirely. A place where truth itself had been dragged into the open, raw, and undeniable. Judge Randall, once the immovable pillar of authority, sat in shackles at the defendant's table, his robe stripped from him, His shoulders slumped like a man decades older than he was. His hands trembled in his lap, not from age but from the weight of confession, the words he could never take back. Reporters filled every corner, their cameras poised to capture every detail, while citizens pressed close to witness the fall of a man who had long sat above them. Detective Harris stood tall near the front, his presence calm but watchful, his eyes steady on Amara, who sat just behind the witness stand. Though her frame was still frail, her skin pale from the toll of the voices she carried, she held herself with a quiet dignity that seemed far beyond her 8 years. The oversized jacket still hung from her shoulders, her braids brushed against her cheeks and her bare feet dangled above the courtroom floor. But her eyes, they were clear, steady, unflinching. She had seen too much to be shaken by the noise around her. When she was called forward, the room leaned in. There was no need for ceremony, no need for oaths, because everyone knew her words cut deeper than promises. She climbed into the witness chair, folding her hands in her lap, and lifted her chin just slightly. The prosecutor, a woman with sharp eyes and a measured tone, asked the first question. "Amara, how did you know about Claire Donovan?" The girl's voice was soft, but it carried. "Because she told me," she said simply. Gasps rustled through the gallery, but she did not falter. "I don't just hear thoughts. I hear the ones people tried to silence. She has been screaming, for years waiting for someone to listen. She showed me the river. She showed me the bracelet. She showed me him." She pointed gently toward Randall, who flinched at her small hand as though it were a blade. The defense tried to object, tried to call her words unreliable, but every sound of protest rang hollow. The bracelet on the table gleamed like a silent witness, its silver charm catching the light. The scratch on its heart-shaped surface seemed to echo the scratch burned into Randall's memory, a mark that no denial could erase. Claire's brother, seated in the front row, wept openly as Amara spoke. His hands covered his mouth, his shoulders shaking, but his eyes never left her. Each word she spoke was like water on parched ground, painful yet healing. "She says she can rest now," Amara whispered, her eyes lowering to the bracelet. "She says thank you because you didn't let him hide her anymore." Randall broke then, sobs racking his body as he muttered again and again, "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." But the words, once a shield, now rang as nothing more than the last breaths of a crumbling lie. When Amara finished, the courtroom did not erupt in noise. Instead, it held its breath in reverence. No one dared to speak over her. No one dared to laugh or question. For the first time in years, the silence in the courthouse was not commanded by the gavel, but earned by truth. The judge who once sentenced others now heard his own sentence delivered by the weight of evidence and the voices of the dead. He was declared guilty of murder in the first degree, his robe forever stained not by law but by the silence he had forced upon Claire Donovan. The gavel fell, but it sounded hollow compared to the words that had already condemned him. As the officers led Randall away in shackles, the crowd erupted, not in chaos this time, but in something more like a release. Some cried, some whispered prayers, and some simply stared in awe at the barefoot child who had changed everything. Claire's brother rushed forward, kneeling before Amara with tears streaming down his face. "You gave her back to us," he said, his voice broken but grateful. "You gave us peace." Amara looked at him, her eyes glistening with something almost like sorrow. "She gave you peace," she said softly. "I just listened." Detective Harris placed a protective hand on her shoulder as reporters surged closer, shouting her name, demanding answers, desperate for a story, but Amara did not speak to them. She leaned against Harris, her small body weary, and whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "There are more voices, so many more. They're waiting." His heart clenched at her words because he realized that this child, this fragile girl with bare feet and haunted eyes, was not free from her burden. She carried the weight of truths untold, and though she had freed one voice, there were countless others calling out to her in the silence. And as the courtroom emptied, as the city buzzed with the story of the fallen judge and the child who revealed him, Amara sat quietly in her chair, her gaze far away, already listening to voices no one else could hear. The girl who listens to silence. The trial ended, but its echoes stretched far beyond the courthouse walls. Newspapers carried headlines in bold, trembling letters. The fall of Judge Randall. Child exposes buried truth. The girl who hears the dead. Television anchors repeated the story with voices half in awe and half in disbelief, their polished tones cracking whenever they replayed the moment Amara whispered about the river and the bracelet. Across the city, people gathered in cafes, in offices, on street corners, debating whether she was a miracle or a curse, an angel or simply a child who had seen too much. Yet through all the noise, Amara remained quiet. After the sentencing, Detective Harris brought her to a safe house far from the reporters' flashing cameras. She sat by the window for hours, watching the world without speaking, her thin fingers tracing circles on the glass. The oversized, blue jacket still hung from her shoulders, the frayed cuffs nearly brushing her knees, and her bare feet pressed softly into the wooden floor, as though she belonged to the earth more than to the people who now wanted to claim her story. Harris tried to talk to her, to ask if she wanted food, rest, or company, but she only looked at him with those old eyes and said, "They're quiet now, but not all of them." He didn't understand at first, but then he realized she wasn't speaking of the reporters or the citizens. She meant the voices. Claire's voice had gone, finally at peace, but in its absence a chorus of others had begun to stir, faint yet insistent, as though freed by the crack in silence that Amara had opened. As the days passed, she became something of a legend. Some people said she was gifted by God, others whispered she was cursed. Families who had lost loved ones knocked on courthouse doors begging for the girl who could hear the unspeakable. Letters poured in, each one a desperate plea. "Help me find my son. Tell me where my sister is. Ask if my wife forgave me before she passed." People wanted miracles, and they wanted them from a child who had never asked to carry such a burden. Harris tried to shield her from it, tried to give her the chance at an ordinary childhood, but he could see in her eyes that ordinary would never belong to her. One night he found her sitting on the porch, the moonlight painting her face in silver. She looked so small, so fragile, and yet there was a strength in her gaze that unsettled him. "They won't stop calling," she whispered. "Their voices are everywhere, waiting. Some are angry, some are afraid, some just want to be remembered." She turned to him then, her expression unreadable. "How can I rest when they can't?" Harris wanted to tell her she was only a child, that it wasn't her responsibility, but the words died in his throat. Because the truth was, Amara had never been just a child. She was something more, something the world didn't yet understand. A week after the sentencing, she disappeared. No one saw her leave. No one heard the creak of the door or the whisper of bare feet on the road. Harris searched for her, frantic and desperate, following trails that vanished into silence. Reporters claimed sightings in distant towns. Some said they saw a barefoot girl with braids walking along highways. Others swore she had passed through small villages, leaving behind whispers of secrets revealed and voices finally stilled. But there was never proof, only stories that spread like wildfire, carried by people who needed to believe. In time, the noise around her faded. The city moved on, as cities always do, consumed by new scandals, new tragedies, new distractions. But for those who had sat in that courtroom, who had felt the air shift when Amara spoke, nothing was the same. Claire's brother found peace at last, visiting the river not with grief but with flowers. The bailiff went home to his daughter and held her tightly, whispering apologies he had long buried. And Detective Harris, though he returned to his duties, carried her memory like a shadow. Sometimes late at night he would swear he heard her voice, soft and distant as though carried on the wind. Listen to the ones no one hears. It wasn't command or demand, it was reminder. And somewhere on some forgotten road, a little girl in a frayed blue jacket walked barefoot beneath the weight of the stars. Her eyes were steady, her steps silent. And though she carried the voices of the lost, she no longer seemed burdened. She was listening, always listening. But in the quiet between the cries, she found something else too. Her own silence, her own peace. The faint promise that even those who scream can one day rest. She did not wait for the world to understand her. She simply moved through it, leaving behind the truth no one else dared to speak. And so the legend of Amara, the girl who could read minds, was never about fear or spectacle. It was about the voices we bury, the secrets we hide, and the simple, undeniable fact that truth has a way of being heard, even through the soft whisper of a child.